Chapter 20. A New Lodger. The long vacation saunters on towards term time like an idle river, very leisurely strolling down a flat country to the sea. Mr. Guppy saunters along with it congenially. He has blunted the blade of his penknife and broken the point off by sticking that instrument into his desk in every direction. Not that he bears the desk any ill will, but he must do something, and it must be something of an unexciting nature, which will lay neither his physical nor his intellectual energies under too heavy contribution. He finds that nothing agrees with him so well as to make little gyrations on one leg of his stool and stab his desk and gape. Kenge and Carboy are out of town, and the articled clerk has taken out a shooting licence and gone down to his father's, and Mr. Guppy's two fellow stipendiaries are away on leave. Mr. Guppy and Mr. Richard Carstone divide the dignity of the office, but Mr. Carstone is for the time being established in Kenge's room, whereat Mr. Guppy chafes so exceedingly that he, with biting sarcasm, informs his mother in the confidential moments when he sups with her off a lobster and lettuce in the Old Street Road, that he is afraid that the office is hardly good enough for swells, and that if he had known there was a swell coming he would have got it painted. Mr. Guppy suspects everybody who enters on the occupation of a stool in Kenge and Carboy's office of entertaining, as a matter of course, sinister designs upon him. He is clear that every such person wants to depose him. If he ever be asked how, why, when, or wherefore, he shuts up one eye and shakes his head. On the strength of these profound views, he, in the most ingenious manner, takes infinite pains to counterplot when there is no plot, and plays the deepest games of chess without any adversary. It is a source of much gratification to Mr. Guppy, therefore, to find the newcomer constantly poring over the papers in Jarndyce and Jarndyce, for he well knows that nothing but confusion and failure can come of that. His satisfaction communicates itself to a third saunterer through the long vacation in Kenge and Carboy's office, to wit, young Smallweed. Whether young Smallweed, metaphorically called small and eat chickweed, as it were jocularly to express a fledgling, was ever a boy is much doubted in Lincoln's Inn. He is now something under 15 and an old limb of the law. He is facetiously understood to entertain a passion for a lady at a cigar shop in the neighbourhood of Chancery Lane, and for her sake to have broken off a contract with another lady to whom he had been engaged for some years. He is a town-made article, of small stature and weazen features, but may be perceived from a considerable distance by means of his very tall hat. To become a Guppy is the object of his ambition. He dresses at that gentleman by whom he is patronised, talks at him, walks at him, founds himself entirely on him. He is honoured with Mr. Guppy's particular confidence, and occasionally advises him from the deep wells of his experience on difficult points in private life. Mr. Guppy has been lolling out of the window all morning after trying all the stools in succession and finding none of them easy, and after several times putting his head into the iron safe with the notion of cooling it. Mr. Smallweed has twice been dispatched for effervescent drinks, and has twice mixed them into 2 official tumblers and stirred them up with a ruler. Mr. Guppy propounds for Mr. Smallweed's consideration the paradox that the more you drink the thirstier you are, and reclines his head upon the window-sill in a state of hopeless languor. While thus looking out into the shade of Old Square, Lincoln's Inn, surveying the intolerable bricks of mortar, Mr. Guppy becomes conscious of a manly whisker emerging from the cloistered walk below and turning itself up in the direction of his face. At the same time a low whistle is wafted through the inn, and a suppressed voice cries, "Hip, Guppy!" "Why, you don't mean it," says Mr. Guppy, aroused. "Small, here's Jobling." Small's head looks out of the window and 2 nods to Jobling. "Where have you sprung from?" inquires Mr. Guppy. "From the Market Gardens down by Deptford. Can't stand it any longer. I must enlist. I say, I wish you'd lend me half a crown. Upon my soul, I'm hungry." Jobling looks hungry, and also has the appearance of having run to seed in the Market Gardens down by Deptford. "I say, just throw out half a crown if you've got one to spare. I want to get some dinner." "Will you come and dine with me?" says Mr. Guppy, throwing out the coin, which Mr. Jobling catches neatly. "How long shall I have to hold out?" says Jobling. "Not half an hour. I'm only waiting here till the enemy goes," returns Mr. Guppy, butting inward his head. "What enemy?" "A new one, going to be articled. Will you wait?" "Can you give a fellow anything to read in the meantime?" says Mr. Jobling. Smallweed suggests the law list, but Mr. Jobling declares with much earnestness that he can't stand it. "You shall have the paper," says Mr. Guppy. "He shall bring it down, but you had better not be seen about here. Sit on our staircase and read. It's a quiet place." Jobling nods intelligence and acquiescence. The sagacious Smallweed supplies him with the newspaper, and occasionally drops his eye upon him from the landing as a precaution against his becoming disgusted with waiting and making untimely departure. At last the enemy retreats, and then Smallweed fetches Mr. Jobling up. "Well, how are you?" says Mr. Guppy, shaking hands with him. "So. How are you?" Mr. Guppy replying that he's not much to boast of, Mr. Jobling ventures on the question, "How is she?" This Mr. Guppy resents as a liberty, retorting, "Jobling, there are chords in the human mind." Jobling begs pardon. "Any subject but that," says Mr. Guppy with the gloomy enjoyment of his injury. "For there are chords, Jobling." Mr. Jobling begs pardon again. During this short colloquy, the active Smallweed, who is of the dinner party, has written in legal characters on a slip of paper, "Return immediately." This notification to all whom it may concern he inserts in the letter box, and putting on the tall hat at the angle of inclination at which Mr. Guppy wears his, informs his patron that they may now make themselves scarce. Accordingly they betake themselves to a neighbouring dining house, of the class known amongst its frequenters by the denomination of slap bang, where the waitress, a bouncing young female of 40, is supposed to have made some impression on the susceptible Smallweed, of whom it may be remarked that he is a weird changeling to whom years are nothing. He stands precociously possessed of centuries of owlish wisdom. If ever he lay in a cradle, it seems as if he must have lain there in a tailcoat. He has an old eye, has Smallweed, and he drinks and smokes in a monkeyish way, and his neck is stiff in his collar, and he is never to be taken in, and he knows all about it, whatever it is. In short, in his bringing up he has been so nursed by law and equity that he has become a kind of fossil imp, to account for those whose terrestrial existence is reported at the public offices that his father was John Doe, and his mother the only female member of the Roe family, also that his first long clothes were made from a blue bag. Into the dining-house, unaffected by the seductive show in the window of artificially whitened cauliflowers and poultry, verdant baskets of peas, coolly blooming cucumbers, and joints ready for the spit, Mr. Smallweed leads the way. They know him there and defer to him. He has his favourite box. He bespeaks all the papers. He is down upon the bald patriarchs who keep them more than 10 minutes afterwards. It's of no use trying him with anything less than a full-sized bread, or proposing to him any jointing cut, unless it is the very best cut. In the matter of gravy he is adamant. Conscious of his elfin power, and submitting to his dread experience, Mr. Guppy consults him in the choice of that day's banquet, turning an appealing look towards him as the waitress repeats the catalogue of viands, and saying, "What do you take, Chick?" Chick, out of the profundity of his artfulness, preferring veal and ham and French beans, and "Don't you forget the stuffing, Polly," with an unearthly cock of his venerable eye. Mr. Guppy and Mr. Jobling give the like order. 3 pint pots of half and half are superadded. Quickly the waitress returns, bearing what is apparently a model of the Tower of Babel, but what is really a pile of plates and flat tin dish covers. Mr. Smallweed, approving of what is set before him, conveys intelligent benignity to his ancient eye, and winks upon her. Then, amid a constant coming in and going out and running about, and a clatter of crockery, and a rumbling up and down of the machine which brings the nice cuts from the kitchen, and a shrill crying for more nice cuts down the speaking pipe, and a shrill reckoning of the cost of nice cuts that have been disposed of, and a general flush and steam of hot joints cut and uncut, and a considerably heated atmosphere, in which the soiled knives and tablecloth seemed to break out spontaneously into eruptions of grease and blotches of beer, the legal triumvirate appeased their appetites. Mr. Jobling is buttoned up closer than mere adornment might require. His hat presents at the rims a peculiar appearance of a glistening nature, as if it had been a favourite snail promenade. The same phenomenon is visible on some parts of his coat, and particularly at the seams. He has the faded appearance of a gentleman in embarrassed circumstances. Even his light whiskers droop with something of a shabby air. His appetite is so vigorous that it suggests spare living for some little time back. He makes such a speedy end of his plate of veal and ham, bringing it to a close while his companions are yet midway in theirs, that Mr. Guppy proposes another. "Thank you, Guppy," says Mr. Jobling. "I really don't know, but I will take another." Another being brought, he falls to with great good will. Mr. Guppy takes a silent notice of him at intervals until he is halfway through his second plate, and stops to take an enjoying pull at his pint pot of half and half, also renewed, and stretches out his legs and rubs his hands. Beholding him in which a glow of contentment, Mr. Guppy says, "You are a man again, Tony." "Well, not quite yet," says Mr. Jobling. "Say just born. Will you take any other vegetables? Grass, peas, summer cabbage?" "Thank you, Guppy," says Mr. Jobling. "I really don't know, but what I will take, summer cabbage." Order given, and with the sarcastic addition of Mr. Smallweed, "Without slugs, Polly," and cabbage produced. "I'm growing up, Guppy," says Mr. Jobling, plying his knife and fork with a relishing steadiness. "Glad to hear it. In fact, I've just turned into my teens," says Mr. Jobling. He says no more until he has performed his task, which he achieves as Messrs. Guppy and Smallweed finish theirs, thus getting over the ground in excellent style, and beating those two gentlemen easily by a veal and ham and a cabbage. "Now, Small," says Mr. Guppy, "what would you recommend about pastry?" "Marrow puddings," says Mr. Smallweed instantly. "Aye, aye," cries Mr. Jobling with an arch look. "There are you." "Thank you, Mr. Guppy. I don't know, but I will take a marrow pudding." 3 marrow puddings being produced, Mr. Jobling adds in a pleasant humour that he is coming of age fast. To these succeeded, by command of Mr. Smallweed, 3 Cheshires, and to those 3 small rums. The apex of the entertainment happily reached, Mr. Jobling puts up his legs on the carpeted seat, having his own side of the box to himself, leans against the wall, and says, "I'm grown up now, Guppy. I've arrived at maturity." "Well, what do you think now?" says Mr. Guppy. "About you don't mind Smallweed?" "Not the least in the world. I have the pleasure of drinking his good health." "Sir, to you," says Mr. Smallweed. "I was saying, what do you think now," pursues Mr. Guppy, "of enlisting?" "Why, what I may think after dinner," returns Mr. Jobling, "is one thing, my dear Guppy, and what I may think before dinner is another thing. Still, even after dinner, I ask myself the question, what am I to do? How am I to live? Il faut manger, you know," says Mr. Jobling, pronouncing that word as if he meant the necessary fixture in an English stable. "Il faut manger, that's the French saying, and mangering is as necessary to me as it is to a Frenchman, or more so. Mr. Smallweed is decidedly of the opinion, much more so. If any man had told me," pursues Jobling, "even so lately as when you and I had the frisk down in Lincolnshire, Guppy, and drove over to see that house at Castle Wold," Mr. Smallweed corrects him, "Chesney Wold." "Chesney Wold. I thank my honourable friend for that cheer. If any man had told me that then I should be as hard up at the present time as I literally find myself, I should have pitched into him," says Mr. Jobling, taking a little rum and water with an air of desperate resignation. "I should have let fly at his head." "Still, Tony, you were on the wrong side of the post then," remonstrates Mr. Guppy. "You were talking about nothing else in the gig." "Guppy," says Mr. Jobling, "I will not deny it. I was on the wrong side of the post, but I trusted to things coming round. That very popular trust in flat things coming round, not in their being beaten round or worked round, but in their coming round, as though a lunatic should trust the world's coming triangular. I had confident expectations that things would come round and be all square," says Mr. Jobling with some vagueness of expression, and perhaps of meaning too. "But I was disappointed. They never did. And when it came to creditors making rows at the office, and to people that the office dealt with making complaints about dirty trifles of borrowed money, why, there was an end of that connection. and of any new professional connection too. For if I was to give a reference tomorrow, it would be mentioned and would sew me up. Then what's a fellow to do? I've been keeping out of the way and living cheap down about the market gardens. But what's the use of living cheap when you've got no money? You might as well live dear. Better, Mr. Smallweed thinks. Certainly it's the fashionable way, and fashion and whiskers have been my weakness. I don't care who knows it, says Mr. Jobling. They are a great weakness. Damn, sir, they are great. Well, proceeds Mr. Jobling, after a defiant visit to his rum and water, what can a fellow do, I ask you, but enlist? Mr. Guppy comes more carefully into the conversation to state what, in his opinion, a fellow can do. His manner is the gravely impressive manner of a man who has not committed himself in life otherwise than he has become the victim of a tender sorrow of the heart. Jobling, says Mr. Guppy, myself and our mutual friend Smallweed. Mr. Smallweed modestly observes, gentlemen both, and drinks. I've had a little conversation on this matter more than once since say got the sack, cries Mr. Jobling bitterly. Say it, Guppy, you mean it? No, left the inn, Mr. Smallweed delicately suggests. Since you left the inn, Jobling, says Mr. Guppy, and I have mentioned to our mutual friend Smallweed a plan I have lately thought of proposing. You know Snagsby, the stationer? I know there is such a stationer, returns Mr. Jobling. He was not ours, and I am not acquainted with him. He is ours, Jobling, and I am acquainted with him, Mr. Guppy retorts. Well, sir, I have lately become better acquainted with him through some accidental circumstances that have made me a visitor in his private life. Those circumstances it is not necessary to offer in argument. They may, or they may not, have some reference to a subject which may, or may not, have cast its shadow on my existence. As it is Mr. Guppy's perplexing way with boastful misery to tempt his particular friends into this subject, and the moment they touch it to turn on them with that trenchant severity about the chords in the human mind, both Mr. Jobling and Mr. Smallweed declined the pitfall by remaining silent. Such things may be, repeats Mr. Guppy, or they may not be. They are no part of the case. It is enough to mention that both Mr. and Mrs. Snagsby are very willing to oblige me, and that Snagsby has, in busy times, a good deal of copying work to give out. He has all Tulkinghorns and an excellent business beside. I believe if our mutual friend Smallweed were put into the box, he could prove this. Mr. Smallweed nods and appears greedy to be sworn. Now, gentlemen of the jury, says Mr. Guppy, I mean now, Jobling, you may say this is a poor prospect of living. Granted. But it's better than nothing and better than enlistment. You want time? There must be time for these late affairs to blow over. You might live through it on much worse terms than by writing for Snagsby. Mr. Jobling is about to interrupt when the sagacious Smallweed checks him with a dry cough and the words, Shakespeare. There are two branches on this subject, Jobling, says Mr. Guppy. That is the first. I come to the second. You know Crook, the Chancellor, across the lane? Come, Jobling, says Mr. Guppy in his encouraging cross-examination tone. I think you know Crook, the Chancellor, across the lane. I know him by sight, says Mr. Jobling. You know him by sight very well, and you know Little Flight? Everybody knows her, says Mr. Jobling. Everybody knows her very well. Now it has been one of my duties of late to pay Flight a certain weekly allowance, deducting from it the amount of her weekly rent, which I have paid, in consequence of instructions I have received, to Crook himself, regularly in her presence. This has brought me into communication with Crook, and into a knowledge of his house and his habits. I know he has a room to let. You may live there at a very low charge, under any name you like, as quietly as if you were 100 miles off. He'll ask no questions, and would accept you as a tenant at a word from me, before the clock strikes, if you choose. And I'll tell you another thing, Jobling, says Mr. Guppy, who has suddenly lowered his voice and become familiar again. He's an extraordinary old chap, always rummaging among a litter of papers and grubbing away at teaching himself to read and write without getting on a bit, as it seems to me. He's a most extraordinary old chap, sir, but I don't know but what it might be worth a fellow's while to look him up a bit. You don't mean, Mr. Jobling begins. I mean, returns Mr. Guppy, shrugging his shoulders with becoming modesty, but I can't make him out. I appeal to our mutual friend Smallweed, whether he or has not heard me remark that I can't make him out. Mr. Smallweed bears the concise testimony. A few. I have seen something of the profession and something of life, Tony, says Mr. Guppy, and it's seldom I can't make a man out, more or less. For such an old card as this, so deep, so sly and secret, though I don't believe he's ever sober, I never come across. Now, he must be precious old, you know, and he has not a soul about him, and he's reported to be immensely rich. And whether he is a smuggler, or a receiver, or an unlicensed pawnbroker, or a money-lender, all of which I have thought likely at different times, it might pay you to knock up a sort of knowledge of him. I don't see why you shouldn't go in for it when everything else suits. Mr. Jobling, Mr. Guppy and Mr. Smallweed all lean their elbows on the table and their chins upon their hands and look at the ceiling. After a time they all drink slowly, lean back, put their hands in their pockets and look at one another. If I had the energy I once possessed, Tony, says Mr. Guppy with a sigh, but there are chords in the human mind. Expressing the remainder of the desolate sentiment in rum and water, Mr. Guppy concludes by resigning the adventure to Tony Jobling, and informing him that during the vacation, while things are slack, his purse, as far as £3 or £4 or even £5 goes, will be at his disposal. For never shall it be said, Mr. Guppy adds with emphasis, that William Guppy turned his back upon his friend. The latter part of the proposal is so directly to the purpose that Mr. Jobling says with emotion, "Guppy, my trump, your fist." Mr. Guppy presents it, saying, "Jobling, my boy, there it is." Mr. Jobling returns, "Guppy, we've been pals now for some years." And Mr. Guppy replies, "Jobling, we have." They then shake hands, and Mr. Jobling adds in a feeling manner, "Thank you, Guppy. I don't know but I will take another glass for old acquaintance' sake." "Crook's last lodger died there," observed Mr. Guppy in an incidental way. "Did he, though?" says Mr. Jobling. "It was a verdict, accidental death. You don't mind that?" "No," says Mr. Jobling, "I don't mind it. But he might as well have died somewhere else. It's devilish odd that he need go and die at my place." Mr. Jobling quite resents this liberty, several times returning to it, in such remarks as, "There are enough places to die in, I should think," or, "He wouldn't have liked my dying at his place, I dare say." However, the compact being virtually made, Mr. Guppy proposes to dispatch the trusty Smallweed to ascertain if Mr. Crook is at home, as in that case they may complete the negotiation without delay. Mr. Jobling approving, Smallweed puts himself under the tall hat and conveys it out of the dining rooms in the Guppy manner. He soon returns with the intelligence that Mr. Crook is at home, and that he has seen him through the shop door, sitting in the back premises, sleeping like 1 o'clock. "Then I'll pay," says Mr. Guppy, "and we'll go and see him. Small, what will it be?" Mr. Smallweed, compelling the attendance of the waitress with one hitch of his eyelash, instantly replies as follows: "4 veals and hams is 3, 4 potatoes is 3 and 4, and 1 summer cabbage is 3 and 6, and 3 marrows is 4 and 6, and 6 breads is 5, and 3 Cheshires is 5 and 3, and 4½ pints of half and half is 6 and 3, and 4 small rums is 8 and 3, and 3 Pollys is 8 and 6. 8 and 6 in a half sovereign, Polly, and 18 pence out." Not at all excited by these stupendous calculations, Smallweed dismisses his friends with a cool nod, and remains behind to take a little admiring notice of Polly, as opportunity may serve, and to read the daily papers, which are so very large in proportion to himself. Shorn of his hat, that when he holds up the Times to run his eye over the columns, he seems to have retired for the night, and to have disappeared under the bedclothes. Mr. Guppy and Mr. Jobling repair to the rag and bottle shop, where they find Crook still sleeping like 1 o'clock. That is to say, breathing stertorously, with his chin upon his breast, and quite insensible to any external sounds, or to even gentle shaking. On the table beside him, among the usual lumber stand, an empty gin bottle and a glass. The unwholesome air is so stained with this liquor that even the green eyes of the cat upon her shelf, as they open and shut and glimmer on the visitors, look drunk. "Hold up here," says Mr. Guppy, giving the relaxed figure of the old man another shake. "Mr. Crook, hello, sir." But it would seem as easy to wake a bundle of old clothes with a spirituous heat smouldering in it. Did you ever see such a stupor as he falls into between drink and sleep, says Mr. Guppy. If this is his regular sleep, returns Jobling, rather alarmed. It'll last a long time one of these days, I'm thinking. It's always more like a fit than a nap, says Mr. Guppy, shaking him again. Halloa, your lordship. Why, he might be robbed 50 times over. Open your eyes. After much ado he opens them, but without appearing to see his visitors or any other objects. Though he crosses one leg on another, and folds his hands, and several times closes and opens his parched lips, he seems to all intents and purposes as insensible as before. He's alive at any rate, says Mr. Guppy. How are you, my Lord Chancellor? I brought a friend of mine, sir, on a little matter of business. The old man still sits, often smacking his dry lips without the least consciousness. After some minutes he makes an attempt to rise. They help him up, and he staggers against the wall and stares at them. How do you do, Mr. Crook, says Mr. Guppy in some discomfiture. How do you do, sir? You're looking charming, Mr. Crook. I hope you're pretty well. The old man, in aiming a purposeless blow at Mr. Guppy, or at nothing, feebly swings himself round and comes with his face against the wall, so he remains for a minute or two heaped up against it, and then staggers down the shop to the front door. The air, the movement in the court, the lapse of time, or the combination of these things recovers him. He comes back pretty steadily, adjusting his fur cap on his head and looking keenly at me. Your servant, gentlemen. I've been dozing. I am hard to wake, odd times. Rather so indeed, sir, responds Mr. Guppy. What, you've been trying to do it, have you, says the suspicious Crook. Only a little, Mr. Guppy explains. The old man's eye resting on the empty bottle, he takes it up, examines it, and slowly tilts it upside down. I say, he cries like the hobgoblin in the story, somebody's been making free here. I assure you we found it so, says Mr. Guppy. Would you allow me to get it filled for you? Yes, I certainly would, cries Crook in high glee. Certainly I would. Don't mention it. Get it filled next door. Sol's Arms, the Lord Chancellor's 14 penny. Bless you, they know me. So he presses the empty bottle upon Mr. Guppy. That gentleman, with a nod to his friend, accepts the trust and hurries out and hurries in again with the bottle filled. The old man receives it in his arms like a beloved grandchild and pats it tenderly. But I say, he whispers with his eyes screwed up after tasting this ain't the Lord Chancellor's 14 penny. This is 18 penny. Thought you might like that better, says Mr. Guppy. You're a nobleman, sir, returns Crook with another taste, and his hot breath seems to come towards them like a flame. You're a baron of the land. Taking advantage of this auspicious moment, Mr. Guppy presents his friend under the impromptu name of Mr. Weevil, and states the object of their visit. Crook, with his bottle under his arm, he never gets beyond a certain point of either drunkenness or sobriety, takes time to survey his proposed lodger, and seems to approve of him. You'd like to see the room, young man, he says. Ah, it's a good room. Been whitewashed. Been cleaned down with soft soap and soda. It's worth twice the rent, letting alone my company when you want it, and such a cat to keep the mice away. Commending the room after this manner, the old man takes them upstairs, where indeed they do find it cleaner than it used to be, and also containing some old articles of furniture, which he has dug up from his inexhaustible stores. The terms are easily concluded, for the Lord Chancellor cannot be hard on Mr. Guppy, associated as he is with Kench and Carboy, Jarndyce and Jarndyce, and other famous claims on his professional consideration, and it is agreed that Mr. Weevil shall take possession on the morrow. Mr. Weevil and Mr. Guppy then repair to Cook's Court, Cursitor Street, where the personal introduction of the former to Mr. Snagsby is effected, and, more important, the vote and interest of Mrs. Snagsby are secured. They then report progress to the eminent Smallweed, waiting at the office in his tall hat for that purpose, and separate, Mr. Guppy explaining that he would terminate his little entertainment by standing treat at the play, but that there are chords in the human mind which would render it a hollow mockery. On the morrow, in the dusk of evening, Mr. Weevil modestly appears at Crook's, by no means incommoded with luggage, and establishes himself in his new lodging, where the two eyes in the shutters stare at him in his sleep, as if they were full of wonder. On the following day, Mr. Weevil, who is a handy, good-for-nothing kind of young fellow, borrows a needle and thread of Miss Flite and a hammer of his landlord, and goes to work devising apologies for window curtains, and knocking up apologies for shelves, and hanging his 2 teacups, milk pot, and crockery sundries on a pennyworth of little hooks, like a shipwrecked sailor making the best of it. But what Mr. Weevil prizes most of all in his few possessions, next after his light whiskers, for which he has had an attachment that only whiskers can awaken in the breast of man, there is a choice collection of copperplate impressions from that truly national work, The Divinities of Albion, or Galaxy Gallery of British Beauty, representing ladies of title and fashion, and every variety of smirk that art combined with capital is capable of producing. With these magnificent portraits, unworthily confined in a bandbox during his seclusion among the market gardens, he decorates his apartment, and as the Galaxy Gallery of British Beauty wears every variety of fancy dress, plays every variety of musical instrument, fondles every variety of dog, ogles every variety of prospect, and is backed up by every variety of flower pot and balustrade, the result is very imposing. But fashion is Mr. Weevil's, as it was Tony Jobling's, weakness. To borrow yesterday's paper from the Sole Arms of an evening, and to read about the brilliant and distinguished meteors that are shooting across the fashionable sky in every direction is unspeakable consolation to him. To know what member of what brilliant and distinguished circle accomplished the brilliant and distinguished feat of joining it yesterday, or contemplates the no less brilliant and distinguished feat of leaving it tomorrow, gives him a thrill of joy. To be informed what the Galaxy Gallery of British Beauty is about, and means to be about, and what galaxy marriages are on the tapis, and what galaxy rumours are in circulation, is to become acquainted with the most glorious destinies of mankind. Mr. Weevil reverts from this intelligence to the galaxy portraits implicated, and seems to know the originals and be known of them. For the rest, he is a quiet lodger, full of handy shifts and devices as before mentioned, able to cook and clean for himself, as well as to carpenter, and developing social inclinations after the shades of evening are falling on the court. At those times when he is not visited by Mr. Guppy, or by a small light in his likeness quenched in a dark hat, he comes out of his dull room, where he has inherited the deal wilderness of desk bespattered with rain of ink, and talks to crook, or is very free, as they call it in the court commendingly, with anyone disposed for conversation. Wherefore Mrs. Piper, who leads the court, is impelled to offer 2 remarks to Mrs. Perkins. Firstly, that if her Johnny was to have whiskers, she could wish him to be identically like that young man's. And secondly, mark my words, Mrs. Perkins, ma'am, and don't you be surprised, Lord bless you, if that young man comes in at last for old Crook's money. Chapter 21. The Smallweed Family. In a rather ill-favoured and ill-savoured neighbourhood, though one of its rising grounds bears the name of Mount Pleasant, the elfin Smallweed, christened Bartholomew, and known on the domestic hearth as Bart, passes that limited portion of his time on which the office and its contingencies have no claim. He dwells in a little narrow street, always solitary, shady and sad, closely bricked in on all sides like a tomb, but where there yet lingers the stump of an old forest tree, whose flavour is about as fresh and natural as the Smallweed smack of youth. There has only been one child in the Smallweed family for several generations. Little old men and women there have been, but no child, until Mr. Smallweed's grandmother, now living, became weak in her intellect and fell, for the first time, into a childish state, with such infantine graces as a total want of observation, memory, understanding, and interest, and an eternal disposition to fall asleep over the fire and into it. Mr. Smallweed's grandmother has undoubtedly brightened the family. Mr. Smallweed's grandfather is likewise of the party. He is in a helpless condition as to his lower, and nearly so as to his upper limbs, but his mind is unimpaired. It holds, as well as it ever held, the first 4 rules of arithmetic, and a certain small collection of the hardest facts. In respect of ideality, reverence, wonder, and other such phrenological attributes. It is no worse off than it used to be. Everything that Mr. Smallweed's grandfather ever put away in his mind was a grub at first, and is a grub at last. In all his life he has never bred a single butterfly. The father of this pleasant grandfather of the neighbourhood of Mount Pleasant was a horny-skinned, two-legged, money-getting species of spider who spun webs to catch unwary flies, and retired into holes until they were entrapped. The name of this old pagan's god was compound interest. He lived for it, married it, died of it. Meeting with a heavy loss in an honest little enterprise in which all the loss was intended to have been on the other side, he broke something necessary to his existence, therefore it couldn't have been his heart, and made an end of his career. As his character was not good, and he had been bred at a charity school in a complete course, according to question and answer, of those ancient people, the Amorites and Hittites, he was frequently quoted as an example of the failure of education. His spirit shone through his son, to whom he had always preached of going out early in life, and whom he made a clerk in a sharp scrivener's office at 12 years old. There the young gentleman improved his mind, which was of a lean and anxious character, and developing the family gifts, gradually elevated himself into the discounting profession. Going out early in life and marrying late, as his father had done before him, he too begat a lean and anxious-minded son, who in his turn, going out early in life and marrying late, became the father of Bartholomew and Judith Smallweed, twins. During the whole time consumed in the slow growth of this family tree, the house of Smallweed, always early to go out and late to marry, has strengthened itself in its practical character, has discarded all amusements, discountenanced all storybooks, fairy tales, fictions and fables, and banished all levities whatsoever. Hence the gratifying fact that it has had no child born to it, and that the complete little men and women whom it has produced have been observed to bear a likeness to old monkeys with something depressing on their minds. At the present time, in the dark little parlour, certain feet below the level of the street, a grim, hard, uncouth parlour, only ornamented with the coarsest of baize table covers and the hardest of sheet iron tea trays, and offering in its decorative colour no bad allegorical representation of Grandfather Smallweed's mind, seated in two black horsehair porter's chairs, one on each side of the fireplace, the superannuated Mr. and Mrs. Smallweed while away the rosy hours. On the stove are a couple of trivets for the pots and kettles, which it is Grandfather Smallweed's usual occupation to watch, and projecting from the chimney-piece between them is a sort of brass gallows for roasting, which he also superintends when it's in action. Under the venerable Mr. Smallweed's seat, and guarded by his spindle legs, is a drawer in his chair, reported to contain property to a fabulous amount. Beside him is a spare cushion with which he is always provided, in order that he may have something to throw at the venerable partner of his respected age, whenever she makes an allusion to money, a subject on which he is particularly sensitive. "And where's Bart?" Grandfather Smallweed inquires of Judy, Bart's twin sister. "He ain't come in yet," says Judy. "It's his tea time, isn't it?" "No." "How much do you mean to say it wants, then?" 10 minutes. "Eh? 10 minutes," loud on the part of Judy. "Oh," says Grandfather Smallweed, 10 minutes. Grandmother Smallweed, who has been mumbling and shaking her head at the trivets, hearing figures mentioned, connects them with money, and screeches like a horrible old parrot without any plumage. £10 notes." Grandfather Smallweed immediately throws the cushion at her. "Drat you, be quiet," says the good old man. The effect of this act of ejaculation is twofold. It not only doubles up Mrs. Smallweed's head against the side of her porter's chair, and causes her to present, when extricated by her granddaughter, a highly becoming state of cap, but the necessary exertion recoils on Mr. Smallweed himself, whom it throws back into his porter's chair like a broken puppet. The excellent old gentleman, being at these times a mere clothes bag, with a black skull cap on top of it, does not present a very animated appearance until he has undergone the two operations at the hands of his granddaughter of being shaken up like a great bottle and poked and punched like a great bolster. Some indication of a neck being developed in him by these means, he and the sharer of his life's evening again fronting one another in their two porters' chairs, like a couple of sentinels long forgotten on their post by the black sergeant Death. Judy the twin is worthy company for these associates. She is so indubitably sister to Mr. Smallweed the younger that the two kneaded into one would hardly make a young person of average proportions. While she so happily exemplifies the before-mentioned family likeness to the monkey tribe, and attired in a spangled robe and a cap, she might walk about the table, land on the top of a barrel organ, without exciting much remark as an unusual specimen. Under existing circumstances, however, she is dressed in a plain, spare gown of brown stuff. Judy never owned a doll, never heard of Cinderella, never played at any game. She once or twice fell into children's company when she was about 10 years old, but the children couldn't get on with Judy, and Judy couldn't get on with them. She seemed like an animal of another species. There was an instinctive repugnance on both sides. It is very doubtful whether Judy knows how to laugh. She has so rarely seen the thing done that the probabilities are strong the other way. Of anything like a youthful laugh she can certainly have no conception. If she were to try one, she would find her teeth in her way, modelling that action of her face as she has unconsciously modelled all its other expressions on her pattern of sordid age. Such is Judy. And her twin brother couldn't wind up at top for his life. He knows no more of Jack the Giant Killer or of Sinbad the Sailor than he knows of the people in the stars. He could as soon play at leapfrog or at cricket as change into a cricket or a frog himself. But he is so much the better off than his sister that on his narrow world of fact an opening has dawned in such a broader regions as to lie within the ken of Mr. Guppy. Hence his admiration and his emulation of that shining enchanter. Judy, with a gong-like clash and a clap, sets one of the sheet-iron tea-trays on the table and arranges cups and saucers. The bread she puts in an iron basket, and the butter, not much of it, in a small pewter plate. Grandfather Smallweed looks hard after the tea as it is served out, and asks Judy where the girl is. "Charlie, do you mean?" says Judy. "Eh?" from Grandfather Smallweed. "Charlie, do you mean?" It touches a spring in Grandmother Smallweed, who, chuckling as usual at the trivet, cries, "Over the water, Charlie! Charlie, over the water! Charlie, over the water! Over the water to Charlie! Charlie, over the water to Charlie!" and becomes quite energetic about it. The grandfather looks at the cushion, but has not sufficiently recovered his late exertion. "Ha!" he says when there is silence. "If that's her name, she eats a deal. It would be better to allow her for her keep." Judy, with her brother's wink, shakes her head and purses up her mouth into no without saying it. "No," returns the old man. "Why not?" "She wants sixpence a day, and we can do it for less," says Judy. "Sure?" Judy answers with a nod of deepest meaning, and calls, as she scrapes the butter on the loaf with every precaution against waste, and cuts it into slices, "You, Charlie, where are you?" Timidly obedient to the summons, a little girl in a rough apron and a large bonnet, with her hands covered with soap and water, and a scrubbing brush in one of them, appears and curtsies. "What work are you about now?" says Judy, making an ancient snap at her like a very sharp old beldame. "I'm cleaning up the backstairs room, miss," replies Charlie. "Mind you do it thoroughly and don't loiter. Shirking won't do for me. Make haste. Go along," cries Judy with a stamp upon the ground. "You girls are more trouble than you're worth by half." On this severe matron, as she returns to her task of scraping the butter and cutting the bread, falls the shadow of her brother, looking in at the window, for whom, knife and loaf in hand, she opens the street door. "Aye, aye, Bart," says Grandfather Smallweed. "Here you are." "Eh?" "Here I am," says Bart. "Been along with your friend again, Bart?" Small nods. "Dining at his expense, Bart?" Small nods again. "That's right. Live at his expense as much as you can. Take warning by his foolish example. That's the use of such a friend, the only use you can put him to," says the venerable sage. His grandson, without receiving this good counsel as dutifully as he might, honours it with all such acceptance as may lie in the slight wink and nod, and takes a chair at the tea-table. The four old faces then hover over the teacups like a company of ghastly cherubim. Mrs. Smallweed perpetually twitching her head and chattering at the trivets, and Mr. Smallweed requiring to be repeatedly shaken up like a large black draught. Yes, yes, says the good old gentleman, reverting to his lesson of wisdom. That's such advice as your father would have given you, Bart. You never saw your father, more's the pity. He was my true son. Whether it is intended to be conveyed that he was particularly pleasant to look at, on that account, does not appear. He was my true son, repeats the old gentleman, folding his bread and butter on his knee. Good accountant, and died 15 years ago. Mrs. Smallweed, following her usual instinct, breaks out with £1,500, £1,500 in a black box, £1,500 locked up, £1,500 put away and hid. Her worthy husband, setting aside his bread and butter, immediately discharges the cushion at her, crushes her against the side of her chair, and falls back on his own, overpowered. His appearance after visiting Mrs. Smallweed with one of these admonitions is particularly impressive and not wholly prepossessing. Firstly, because the exertion generally twists his black skull-cap over one eye and gives him an air of goblin rakishness. Secondly, because he mutters violent imprecations against Mrs. Smallweed. And thirdly, because the contrast between those powerful expressions and his powerless figure is suggestive of a baleful old malignant who would be very wicked if he could. All this, however, is so common in the Smallweed family circle that it produces no impression. The old gentleman is merely shaken and has his internal feathers beaten up. The cushion is restored to its usual place beside him, and the old lady, perhaps with her cap adjusted and perhaps not, is planted in her chair again, ready to be bowled down like a ninepin. Some time elapses in the present instance before the old gentleman is sufficiently cool to resume his discourse, and even then he mixes it up with several edifying expletives addressed to the unconscious partner of his bosom, who holds communication with nothing on earth but the trivets. As thus: if your father, Bart, had lived longer, he might have been worth a deal of money, you brimstone chatterer. Just as he was beginning to build up the house that he had been making the foundations for through many a year, you jade of a magpie, jackdaw and poll parrot, what do you mean he took ill and died of a low fever? Always being sparing and a spare man full of business care, I should like to throw a cat at you instead of a cushion. And I will too, if you make such a confounded fool of yourself. And your mother, who was a prudent woman, dry as a chip, just dwindled away like touchwood after you and Judy were born. You're an old pig, you're a brimstone pig, you're a head of swine. Judy, not interested in what she has often heard, begins to collect in a basin various tributary streams of tea from the bottoms of cups and saucers, and from the bottom of the teapot for the little charwoman's evening meal. In like manner she gets together in the iron bread basket as many outside fragments and worn-down heels of loaves as the rigid economy of the house has left in existence. But your father and me were partners, Bart, says the old gentleman, and when I'm gone you and Judy will have it all there is. It is rare for you both that you went out early in life, Judy to the flower business and you to the law. You won't want to spend it, you'll get your living without it. And put more to it, when I am gone, Judy will go back to the flower business and you'll stick to the law. One might infer from Judy's appearance that her business rather lay with the thorns than the flowers, but she has in her time been apprenticed to the art and mystery of artificial flower making. A close observer might perhaps detect both in her eye and her brother's, when their venerable grandsire anticipates his being gone, some little impatience to know when he may be going, and some resentful opinion that it's time he went. Now, if everybody's done, says Judy, completing her preparations, I'll have that girl into her tea. She would never leave off if she took it by herself in the kitchen. Charlie is accordingly introduced, and under a heavy fire of eyes sits down to a basin and druidical ruin of bread and butter. In the active superintendence of this young person, Judy Smallweed appears to attain a perfectly geological age, and to date from the remotest periods. Her systematic manner of flying at her and pouncing on her, with or without pretence, whether or no, is wonderful, evincing an accomplishment in the art of girl driving seldom reached by the oldest practitioners. Now don't stare about you all the afternoon, cries Judy, shaking her head and stamping her foot, as she happens to catch the glance which has been previously sounding the basin of tea, but take your victuals and get back to work. Yes, miss, says Charlie. Don't say yes, returns Miss Smallweed, for I know what you girls are. Do it without saying it, and then I may begin to believe you. Charlie swallows a great gulp of tea in a token of submission, and so disperses the druidical readings that Miss Smallweed charges her not to gormandize, which, in you girls, she observes, is disgusting. Charlie might find some more difficulty in meeting her views on the general subject of girls, but for a knock at the door. See who it is, and don't chew when you open it, cries Judy. The object of her attentions withdrawing for the purpose, Miss Smallweed takes that opportunity of jumbling the remainder of the bread and butter together, and launching 2 or 3 dirty teacups into the ebb tide of the basin of tea, as a hint that she considers the eating and drinking terminated. Now who is it, and what's wanted? Says the snappish Judy. It is one Mr. George, it appears. Without another announcement or ceremony, Mr. George walks in. Whew, says Mr. George. You are hot in here. Always a fire, eh? Well, perhaps you do right to get used to one. Mr. George makes the latter remark to himself as he nods to Grandfather Smallweed. Oh, it's you, cries the old gentleman. How do you do? How do you do? Middling, replies Mr. George, taking a chair. Your granddaughter I have had the honour of seeing before. My service to you, miss. This is my grandson, says Grandfather Smallweed. You hadn't seen him before. He's in the law and not much at home. My service to him too. He is like his sister. He is very like his sister. He is devilish like his sister, says Mr. George, laying a great and not altogether complimentary stress on his last adjective. And how's the world use you, Mr. George? Grandfather Smallweed inquires, slowly rubbing his legs. Pretty much as usual, like a football. He is a swarthy brown man of 50, well made and good looking, with crisp dark hair, bright eyes, and a broad chest. His sinewy and powerful hands, as sunburnt as his face, have evidently been used to a pretty rough life. What is curious about him is that he sits forward on his chair as if he were from long habit, allowing space for some dress or accoutrements that is altogether laid aside. His step, too, is measured and heavy, and would go well with a weighty clash and jingle of spurs. He is close-shaved now, but his mouth is set as if his upper lip had been for years familiar with a great moustache, and his manner of occasionally laying the open palm of his broad brown hand upon it is to the same effect. Altogether, one might guess Mr. George to have been a trooper once upon a time. A special contrast Mr. George makes to the Smallweed family. Trooper was never yet billeted upon a household more unlike him. It is a broadsword to an oyster knife. His developed figure and their stunted forms, his large manner filling any amount of room, and their little narrow pinched ways, his sounding voice and their sharp spare tones, are in the strongest and strangest opposition. As he sits in the middle of the grim parlour, leaning a little forward with his hands upon his thighs and his elbows squared, he looks as though if he remained there long he would absorb into himself the whole family and the whole 4-roomed house, extra little back kitchen and all. Do you rub your legs to rub life into them? He asks of Grandfather Smallweed after looking round the room. Well, it's partly habit, Mr. George, and yes, it partly helps the circulation, he replies. The circulation, repeats Mr. George, folding his arms upon his chest and seeming to become 2 sizes larger. Not much of that, I should think. Truly, I'm old, Mr. George, says Grandfather Smallweed, but I can carry my years. I'm older than her, nodding at his wife. And see what she is? You're a brimstone chatterer, with a sudden revival of his late hostility. Unlucky old soul, says Mr. George, turning his head in that direction. Don't scold the old lady. Look at her here, with her poor cap half off her head, and her poor hair all in a muddle. Hold up, ma'am. That's better. There we are. Think of your mother, Mr. Smallweed, says Mr. George, coming back to his seat from assisting her, if your wife ain't enough. I suppose you're an excellent son, Mr. George, the old man hints with a leer. The colour of Mr. George's face rather deepens as he replies, Why, no, I wasn't. I'm astonished at it. So am I. I ought to have been a good son. I think I meant to have been one, but I wasn't. I was a thundering bad son, and that's the long and the short of it, and never was a credit to anybody. Surprising, cries the old man.
However, Mr. George resumes, the less said about it the better now. Come, you know the agreement. Always a pipe out of the 2 months' interest. Bosh, it's all correct. You needn't be afraid to order the pipe. Here's the new bill, and here's the 2 months' interest money. And the devil and all of a scrape it is to get it together in my business. Mr. George sits with his arms folded, consuming the family in the parlour, while Grandfather Smallweed is assisted by Judy to 2 black leathern cases out of a locked bureau, in one of which he secures the document he has just received, and from the other takes another similar document which he hands to Mr. George, who twists it up for a pipe light. As the old man inspects through his glasses every upstroke and downstroke of both documents before he releases them from their leathern prison, and as he counts the money 3 times over, and requires Judy to say every word she utters at least twice, and is as tremulously slow of speech and action as it is possible to be, this business is a long time in progress. When it is quite concluded, and not before he disengages his ravenous eyes and fingers from it, and answers Mr. George's last remark by saying, "Afraid to order the pipe? We are not so mercenary as that, sir. Judy, see directly to the pipe, and a glass of cold brandy and water for Mr. George." The sportive twins, who have been looking straight before them all this time, except when they have been engrossed by the black leathern cases, retire together, generally disdainful of the visitor, but leaving him to the old man as 2 young cubs might leave a traveller to the parental bear. "And there you sit, I suppose, all the day long, eh?" says Mr. George, with folded arms. Just so, the old man nods. "And you don't occupy yourself at all?" "I watch the fire and the boiling and the roasting." "When there is any," says Mr. George, with great expression. "Just so, where there is any." "Don't you read or get read to?" The old man shakes his head with a sharp, sly triumph. "No, no, we have never been readers in our family. It don't pay. Stuff, idleness, folly. No, no." "There's not much to choose between your 2 states," says the visitor, in a key too low for the old man's dull hearing, as he looks from him to the old woman and back again. I say, in a louder voice, "I hear you. You sell me up at last, I suppose, when I'm a day in arrear." "My dear friend," cries Grandfather Smallweed, stretching out both hands to embrace him. "Never, never, my dear friend. But my friend in the city that I got to lend you the money, he might." "Oh, you can't answer for him," says Mr. George, finishing inquiry in his lower key with the words, "You lying old rascal." "My dear friend, he is not to be depended upon. I wouldn't trust him. He will have his bond, my dear friend." "Devil doubt him," says Mr. George. Charlie, appearing with a tray, on which are the pipe, a small paper of tobacco, and the brandy and water, he asks her, "How did you come here? You haven't got the family face." "I goes out to work, sir," returns Charlie. The trooper, if trooper he be or have been, takes her bonnet off with a light touch for so strong a hand, and pats her on the head. He gives the house almost a wholesome look. It wants a bit of youth as much as it wants fresh air. Then he dismisses her, lights his pipe, and drinks to Mr. Smallweed's friend in the city, the one solitary flight of that esteemed old gentleman's imagination. "So you think he might be hard upon me, eh?" "I think he might. I'm afraid he would. I've known him do it," says Grandfather Smallweed incautiously, 20 times. Incautiously, because his stricken better half, who has been dozing over the fire for some time, instantly aroused, and jabbers, £20,000, 20 £20 notes in a money box, 20 guineas, 20 million, 20%, 20, and is then cut short by the flying cushion, which the visitor, to whom this singular experiment appears to be a novelty, snatches from her face as it crushes her in the usual manner. "You're a brimstone idiot. You're a scorpion, a brimstone scorpion. You're a sweltering toad. You're a chattering, clattering broomstick witch that ought to be burnt," gasps the old man, prostrate in his chair. "My dear friend, will you shake me up a little?" Mr. George, who has been looking first at one of them and then at the other, as if he were demented, takes his venerable acquaintance by the throat on receiving this request, and dragging him upright in his chair as easily as if he were a doll, appears in 2 minds whether or no to shake all future power of cushioning out of him and shake him to his grave. Resisting the temptation, but agitating him violently enough to make his head roll like a harlequin's, he puts him smartly down in his chair again, and adjusts his skull cap with such a rub that the old man winks with both eyes for a minute afterwards. "Oh, Lord!" gasped Mr. Smallweed. "That'll do. Thank you, my dear friend. That'll do. Oh, dear me, I'm out of breath. Oh, Lord!" And Mr. Smallweed says it not without evident apprehensions of his dear friend, who still stands over him, looming larger than ever. The alarming presence, however, gradually subsides into its chair and falls to smoking in long puffs, consoling itself with the philosophical reflection, "The name of your friend in the city begins with a D, comrade, and you're about right respecting the bond." "Did you speak, Mr. George?" inquires the old man. The trooper shakes his head and leans forward with his right elbow on his right knee and his pipe supported in that hand, while his other hand, resting on his left leg, squares his left elbow in a martial manner, continues to smoke. Meanwhile he looks at Mr. Smallweed with grave attention, and now and then fans the cloud of smoke away, in order that he may see him the more clearly. "I take it," he says, making just as much a little change of his position as will enable him to reach the glass to his lips with a round full action, "that I am the only man alive, or dead either, that gets the value of a pipe out of you." "Well," returns the old man, "it's true that I don't see company, Mr. George, and I don't treat, if I can't afford to it. But as you in your pleasant way made your pipe a condition, why, it's not for the value of it. That's no great thing. It was a fancy to get it out of you, to have something in for my money." "Ah, you're prudent, prudent, sir," cries Grandfather Smallweed, rubbing his legs. "Very. I always was, Puff. It's a sure sign of my prudence that I ever found the way here, Puff. Also that I am what I am, Puff. I'm well known to be prudent," says Mr. George, composedly smoking. "I rose in life that way." "Don't be downhearted, sir. You may rise yet." Mr. George laughs and drinks. "And you no relations now?" asks Grandfather Smallweed with a twinkle in his eyes, "who would pay off this little principal, or who would lend you a good name or two that I could persuade my friend in the city to make you a further advance upon?" "Two good names would be sufficient for my friend in the city. Had you no such relations, Mr. George?" Mr. George, still composedly smoking, replies, "If I had, I shouldn't trouble them. I have been trouble enough to my belongings in my day. It may be a very good sort of penitence in a vagabond who has wasted the best time of his life to go back then to decent people that he never was a credit to, and live upon them. But it's not my sort. The best kind of amends, then, for having gone away is to keep away, in my opinion." "But natural affection, Mr. George," hints Grandfather Smallweed. "For two good names, eh?" says Mr. George, shaking his head, and still composedly smoking. "No, that's not my sort either." Grandfather Smallweed has been gradually sliding down in his chair since his last adjustment, and is now a bundle of clothes with a voice in it calling for Judy. That houri appearing, shakes him up in the usual manner, and is charged by the old gentleman to remain near him, for he seems chary of putting his visitor to the trouble of repeating his late attentions. "Ha!" he observes when he is in trim again. "If you could have traced out the captain, Mr. George, it would have been the making of you, when you first came here, in consequence of our advertisement in the newspapers. When I say our, I'm alluding to the advertisements of my friend in the city, and one or two others who embark their capital in the same way, and are so friendly towards me as sometimes to give me a lift with my little pittance. If at that time you could have helped us, Mr. George, it would have been the making of you." "I was willing enough to be made, as you call it," says Mr. George, smoking not quite so placidly as before, for since the entrance of Judy he has been in some measure disturbed by a fascination, not of the admiring kind, which obliges him to look at her as she stands by her grandfather's chair. "But on the whole I'm glad I wasn't now." "Why, Mr. George, in the name of brimstone, why?" says Grandfather Smallweed, with a plain appearance of exasperation, brimstone apparently suggested by his eye lighting upon Mrs. Smallweed in her slumber. "For two reasons, comrade." "And what two reasons, Mr. George, in the name of our friend in the city?" suggests Mr. George, composedly drinking. If you like, what two reasons?" "In the first place," returns Mr. George, still looking at Judy as if she, being so old and so like her grandfather, is indifferent to which of the two he addresses, "you gentlemen took me in. You advertised that Mr. Horden, Captain Horden, if you hold to the saying, once a captain, always a captain, was to hear something to his advantage." "Well?" returns the old man, shrilly and sharply. "Well," says Mr. George, smoking on, "I wouldn't have been much to his advantage to have been clapped into prison by the whole bill and judgment trade of London. How do you know that? Some of his rich relations might have paid his debts or compounded for them. Besides, he has taken us in. He owed us immense sums all round. I would sooner have strangled him and had no return. If I sit here thinking of him," snarls the old man, holding up his impotent 10 fingers, "I want to strangle him now." And in a sudden access of fury he throws the cushion at the unoffending Mrs. Smallweed, but it passes harmlessly on one side of her chair. "I don't need to be told," returns the trooper, taking his pipe from his lips for a moment, and carrying his eyes back from following the progress of the cushion to the pipe bowl, which is burning low, that he carried on heavily and went to ruin. "I've been at his right hand many a day when he was charging upon ruin full gallop. I was with him when he was sick and well, rich and poor. I laid this hand upon him after he had run through everything and broken down everything beneath him, when he held a pistol to his head." "I wish he'd let it off," says the benevolent old man, "and blown his head into as many pieces as he owed pounds." "That would have been a smash indeed," returns the trooper coolly. "Anyway, he had been young, hopeful, and handsome in the days gone by, and I'm glad I never found him when he was neither, to lead to results so much to his advantage. There's reason number one." "I hope number two's as good," snarls the old man. "Why, no, it's more of a selfish reason. If I had found him, I must have gone to the other world to look. He was there." "How do you know he was there?" "He wasn't here." "How do you know he wasn't here?" "Don't lose your temper as well as your money," says Mr. George, calmly knocking the ashes out of his pipe. "He was drowned long before. I'm convinced of it. He went over a ship's side, whether intentionally or accidentally, I don't know. Perhaps your friend in the city does. Do you know what that tune is, Mr. Smallweed?" he adds, after breaking off to whistle one accompanied on the table with an empty pipe. "Tune?" says the old man. "No, we never have tunes here." "That's the Dead March in Saul. They bury soldiers to it, so it's the natural end of the subject. Now, if your pretty granddaughter, excuse me, miss, will condescend to take care of this pipe for 2 months, we shall save the cost of one next time. Good evening, Mr. Smallweed." "My dear friend," the old man gives him both his hands. "So you think your friend in the city will be hard upon me if I fall in the pavement?" says the trooper, looking down upon him like a giant. "My dear friend, I'm afraid he will," returns the old man, looking up at him like a pygmy. Mr. George laughs, and with a glance at Mr. Smallweed and a parting salutation to the scornful Judy, strides out of the parlour, clashing imaginary sabres and other metallic appurtenances as he goes. "You're a damn rogue," says the old gentleman, making a hideous grimace at the door as he shuts it. "But I'll lime you, you dog, I'll lime you." After this amiable remark his spirit soars into those enchanting regions of reflection which its education and pursuits have opened to it, and again he and Mrs. Smallweed while away the rosy hours, two unrelieved sentinels, forgotten as aforesaid by the black sergeant. While the twain are faithful to their post, Mr. George strides through the streets with a massive kind of swagger, and a grave enough face. But it is 8 o'clock now, and the day is fast drawing in. He stops hard by Waterloo Bridge and reads a playbill, decides to go to Astley's Theatre, being there, is much delighted with the horses and the feats of strength, looks at the weapons with a critical eye, disapproves the combats as giving evidences of unskilful swordsmanship, but is touched home by the sentiments in the last scene when the Emperor of Tartary gets up into a cart and condescends to bless the united lovers by hovering over them with the Union Jack. His eyelashes are moistened with emotion. The theatre over, Mr. George comes across the water and again makes his way to that curious region lying about Haymarket and Leicester Square, which is a centre of attraction to indifferent foreign hotels and indifferent foreigners, racket courts, fighting men, swordsmen, foot guards, old china, gaming houses, exhibitions, and a large medley of shabbiness and shrinking out of sight. Penetrating the heart of this region, he arrives by a court and a long whitewashed passage at a great brick building composed of bare walls, floors, roof rafters, and skylights, on the front of which, if it can be said to have any front, is painted "George's Shooting Gallery and Company." Into George's shooting gallery and company he goes, and in it there are gas lights, partly turned off now, and two whitened targets for rifle shooting and archery accommodation, and fencing appliances, and all the necessaries for the British art of boxing. None of these sports or exercises are being pursued in George's shooting gallery tonight, which is so devoid of company that a little grotesque man with a large head has it all to himself, and lies asleep upon the floor. The little man is dressed something like a gunsmith, in a green baize apron and cap. His face and hands are dirty with gunpowder and begrimed with the loading of guns. As he lies in the light before a glaring white target, the black upon him shines again. Not far off is the strong, rough, primitive table with a vice upon it, at which he had been working. He is a little man with a face all crushed together, who appears from a certain blue and speckled appearance that one of his cheeks presents to have been blown up in the way of business at some odd time or times. "Phil," says the trooper in a quiet voice. "All right," cries Phil, scrambling to his feet. "Anything been doing?" "Flat as ever. So much swipe," says Phil. 5 dozen rifle and a dozen pistol. As to aim, Phil gives a howl at the recollection. "Shut up shop, Phil." Phil moves about to execute this order. It appears that he is lame, though able to move very quickly. On the speckled side of his face he has no eyebrow, and on the other side he has a bushy black one, which want of uniformity gives him a very singular and rather sinister appearance. Everything seems to have happened to his hands that could possibly take place consistently with the retention of all his fingers, for they are notched and seamed and crumpled all over. He appears to be very strong, and lifts heavy benches about as if he had no idea of what weight was. He has a curious way of limping round the gallery with his shoulder against the wall, and tacking off at objects he wants to lay hold of, instead of going straight to them, which has left a smear all round the 4 walls, conventionally called Phil's mark. The custodian of George's gallery, in George's absence, concludes his proceedings, when he has locked the great doors and turned out all the lights but one, which he leaves to glimmer, by dragging out from a wooden cabin in a corner 2 mattresses and bedding. These being drawn to opposite ends of the gallery, the trooper makes his own bed, and Phil makes his. "Phil," says the master, walking towards him without his coat and waistcoat, looking more soldierly than ever in his braces, "you were found in the doorway, weren't you?" "Gutter," says Phil. "Watchman tumbled over me." "Then vagabondising came natural to you from the beginning?" "Natural as possible," says Phil. "Good night." "Good night, governor." Phil cannot even go straight to bed, but finds it necessary to shoulder round 2 sides of the gallery and tack off at his mattress. The trooper, after taking a turn or 2 in the rifle distance, and looking up at the moon now shining through the skylights, strides to his own mattress by a shorter route and goes to bed too.